16 years. That was the sentence. He would not serve all of it. Bogota, September the 22nd, 1999. A government building, unremarkable. The kind of place people go to renew a card they have renewed a dozen times before. Fluorescent light, a number called, a line that moves slowly because it is Bogota, and lines always move slowly. A man walks up to a counter and hands over identification. The clerk barely looks up. The name on the card is not his. The face is close enough. He is 50 years old by now, though the papers say 60. Though nobody checks that closely. Though nobody has ever checked that closely with him. Which by this point in his life, he has learned is the one rule of the world that has never once failed him. You have heard this scene before. It opened this entire series in our very first hour. Before you knew who he was, or what he had done, or how many times an institution had already let him go. We told you then that we would come back to it, once you understood everything the clerk in that room did not. This is us coming back. He gets his card. He walks out into the afternoon. We are going to spend the rest of this hour explaining exactly how a man arrives at that counter, on that day, holding a stranger's name in his hand. And then we are going to tell you, honestly, that the story simply stops after it, because that is what actually happened, and this series has never once smoothed over an ending, just because a smoother one would be easier to listen to. The road to that counter starts 14 years earlier than the counter itself, on the 31st of August, 1994, when Pedro López walked out of Garcia Moreno prison in Quito, a free man, 2 years early. The official reason given was good behavior, the same phrase, more or less, that had followed him out of a Colombian prison decades before, after he killed 3 men with a knife of his own making, and the system decided the paperwork barely needed adjusting to reflect it. It is worth noticing how consistently that specific phrase, good behavior, keeps attaching itself to this specific man across 2 different countries and 2 different decades, as though quiet compliance inside an institution were the only quality anyone in a position to release him ever actually bothered to measure. He was deported from Ecuador immediately upon release, and detained briefly on arrival back in Colombia. The record is not entirely consistent on why. Some accounts frame it as a routine immigration hold, the kind of paperwork delay that would have applied to almost anyone crossing that particular border under those particular circumstances. Others describe an outstanding Colombian warrant waiting for him specifically. Either way, Colombian authorities took custody of him, and Colombian prosecutors ran directly into the same wall that had shaped almost every institutional encounter in this entire story. They could not build a prosecutable case against him for the Colombian killings. It is worth asking, plainly, why not? This was not a case lacking evidence in any general sense. 3 countries' worth of newspapers had covered pieces of it. An entire prosecution's file already existed in Ecuador, and López himself had, at various points, confessed to killings across all 3 borders in his own words. What Colombia appears to have lacked was not evidence, but jurisdiction, coordination, and the specific documentary chain a domestic court would need to convict on crimes committed, investigated, and confessed to somewhere else. The same fractured, disconnected system that had let him move freely between countries for a decade as a killer was now, with a strange kind of symmetry, making it difficult to hold him accountable, even after he had already been caught. Flor Alba Sanchez, whose murder we told you about back in our 3rd episode, remains the one clear exception, the single Colombian case that had already gone to trial. Beyond her, the record on exactly what Colombia attempted afterward, and exactly why it failed, is thin and inconsistent across the sources we reviewed, and we are not going to fill that thinness in with anything more confident than what actually survives in the documentation. What Colombia did instead, faced with a case its prosecutors evidently felt unable to carry, was declare him legally insane and commit him to a psychiatric institution. He remained there roughly 4 years. We want to sit with that decision for a moment, because it is, in its own quiet way, one of the strangest turns in this entire series, and one of the ones most worth pausing on. This is not a story that lacks documentation of intent, or method, or years of sustained, deliberate, geographically distributed behavior. Pedro López did not kill in a single frenzied episode that a court might reasonably struggle to characterize. He killed with method, over years, across 3 countries, adjusting his approach specifically to avoid the children he judged too risky to take, choosing his ground, choosing his moments, understanding his own odds with an accountant's precision. That is not, by any ordinary definition, the profile of a man who does not know what he is doing or why. And yet, the legal conclusion that Colombia ultimately settled on, when its own prosecutors could not make a case stick, was insanity. A different flavor of institutional shrug than the ones we have shown you before in this series, dressed in more clinical, more forgivable sounding language, but a shrug all the same. We are not in a position to adjudicate that psychiatric determination for you from here, decades later, with only the information available to us. We are only pointing out plainly that it conveniently resolved, on paper, a case that the system otherwise did not appear to know how to resolve at all, and that this is now the 4th country-level institution in this story to have found a formal, official way to stop looking at him without ever fully accounting for what he had done. In 1998, he was declared sane again and released. On a bond that different sources put at somewhere under $100, one figure we found specifically puts it at around 70. A number that small, attached to a case with victims numbering anywhere from 53 to several hundred, depending on whose account you believe, is exactly the kind of detail this series has asked you, from its very first episode, to notice rather than skim past on your way to the next fact. Roughly a year of his life passes here, with almost nothing attached to it in the historical record. No confirmed sightings that we could locate, no further charges, no interviews, no headlines, no glimpse of him at all. A man who had, by any accounting, taken more lives than nearly anyone else in recorded criminal history, was released back into the world on a sum of money most people would not think twice about spending on a single dinner out. And the record simply goes quiet around him for approximately 12 months. A silence that, by this point in the series, should feel less like an absence of information and more like a pattern completing itself one final time. 3 countries, 3 decades, more or less. And every single time the silence closes back in around him, it is because nobody in a position to keep watching decided that watching was worth the trouble. Which brings us back to that registry counter. In September of 1999, roughly a year after his release from the psychiatric institution, the identification he presented that day belonged, by the fullest account we could locate, to a 60-year-old man from the town of Ipe named Israel Cessped. We do not know how Pedro López came to possess those papers. We do not know what became of the actual Israel Cessped, whether he was a willing accomplice, an unwitting victim of identity theft, or something else entirely. And that is not a gap we are willing to fill with speculation, dressed up as narration, the way a less careful telling of this story might be tempted to. What we can tell you is that this was, so far as the surviving record shows, the last confirmed sighting of Pedro López. Not a headline, not an arrest, a single, forgettable, bureaucratic transaction at a government counter, using a stranger's name in a country that had already tried him, sentenced him, released him, institutionalized him, declared him sane, and released him again, without ever once managing to keep continuous track of exactly where he actually was for more than a year at a stretch. The record does not simply go dark after that afternoon and stay dark. It keeps producing fragments for years afterward. It just stops producing anything that resolves into a clean answer. In 2002, Colombian National Police, working together with Interpol, issued a warrant for his arrest in connection with a killing that bore a resemblance to his earlier method. A fragment suggesting that, whatever had become of him, at least some part of the pattern may not have ended in 1999 after all. 3 years later, in 2005, that warrant was quietly deactivated after Colombia's National Institute of Forensic Medicine claimed to have matched an unidentified corpse to Pedro López. The National Registry accepted that claim administratively, enough to close a file, enough to remove a name from an active wanted list, enough for one government office to consider the matter settled. But it left behind no independently confirmed identification that we could locate anywhere in the record. And most reporting on this case in the years since has continued to describe him as a fugitive with an unknown location, rather than as a closed and settled matter. Two institutions, in other words, appear to genuinely disagree with each other about whether this case is even finished. One having quietly filed him away as dead, the other still describing him, years later, as a man who might still be out there somewhere. He has since been named, speculatively, as a possible suspect in at least one later killing, a woman named Andrea Marcela Garcia Buitrago, murdered in Tunja, Colombia in 2012. In a manner some investigators noted bore similarities to his earlier killing of Flor Alba Sanchez. We want to be exactly as careful with this detail as this series has tried to be with everything else in it. This is speculation, based on similarity of method, offered by people examining an unsolved case more than a decade after his last confirmed sighting. It is not an established link, and we are not treating it as one. We are including it here only because it belongs in a complete accounting of every place his name has surfaced since 1999, not because we believe it settles anything at all. So, is he alive? We do not know, and we are not going to pretend to you that we do, because that has been the discipline of this entire series from its very first sentence. And this is exactly the moment where abandoning that discipline would do the most damage to everything we've told you so far. Some people who have studied this case believe he was killed sometime after his release, by a vigilante, by a victim's family member, by someone who decided, the way that Ayacuchoan community in Peru once nearly decided, that the state was never going to finish this properly on its own, and that somebody else was going to have to. Others believe he simply assumed a new identity, the way he apparently did at least once already at that registry counter, and kept living quietly as someone else entirely, in a small town or a city neighborhood, where nobody had any reason to look twice at an elderly man keeping to himself. If he did, he would be well into his late 70s by now, an old man, indistinguishable on the street from any other old man, carrying inside him the only complete account of everything this series has spent 5 hours trying to reconstruct from the outside. We are not going to manufacture a resolution here that the actual record does not support. We told you, in our very first episode, that this series does not end with a verdict, a body identified, or a courtroom scene where the right person finally pays in full for what was done. This is that ending. It is not the ending anyone would choose to write if this were fiction instead of a documented life. It is simply the one we actually have, and we think you deserve to hear it stated plainly, rather than dressed up as something more complete than it is. Here is what we do know with total certainty, and what we want to leave you with, instead of a tidy conclusion. This story was never going to earn. We know that a boy was born into a country killing itself, and that a sequence of adults, a mother, a stranger, a teacher, a prison system, a country, then a second country, then a third. Each had a chance to be the person who stopped what was coming, and each, in turn, failed to be that person, in a slightly different way, at a slightly different point. We know that the same specific institutional shrug repeated itself with almost mechanical consistency on 3 separate occasions across 3 separate countries over more than 2 decades, and that each time it was not an investigator or a detective who finally caught up with him, but ordinary people acting on their own, a community in the Andes, 2 market vendors who trusted their own unease enough to say it out loud, a mother named Carlina Ramon who screamed instead of looking away when it would have been so much easier to look away. We know the names of some of the people he took: Hortensia Garces Lozada, who sold newspapers on the streets of Ambato; Flor Alba Sanchez, killed in his own hometown, of all the places on earth he could have chosen; Blanca Bautista, found buried beside her. We know he once called himself the man of the century, sitting in a cell, apparently untroubled by what that sentence actually meant. And we know that whatever number truly belongs to him, 53, 110, 200, or something in between that we will simply never be able to prove either way, every single one of those numbers, at every point along that range, is built out of a specific child who had a name, a family, and a life that ended for absolutely no reason that will ever make sense to anyone listening to this, in any language, in any country, at any point from now on. And we know that somewhere, in a filing cabinet in Bogotá, there sits a piece of identification belonging to a 60-year-old man from Ipe named Israel Cessped, and that the last confirmed trace of Pedro López on this earth is the moment he used it to walk out of a government office into an ordinary September afternoon and out of the record entirely. We are not going to tell you what happened to him after that, because nobody actually knows, and we have told you the truth about that not knowing every single time it has come up across this entire series. We are only going to tell you, one final time, the same thing we told you at the very beginning, before you knew any of the rest of it. This was never a story about catching a monster. It was a story about how completely, and how many separate times, across how many separate institutions, a monster was allowed to simply walk away, and about the ordinary people, unarmed, unaided, and largely unthanked, who were the only ones who ever really tried to stop him at all.